Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And while people are getting their food and settling down, I'd like to welcome you back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm the president, Adam Posen, and it's really a terrific thing to be holding this event today on the IMF's new report on coping with inequality and the best ways to do it. We are trying to move to a new format where we're starting a little earlier at these lunches, and we've gotten partway there. We'll continue to press for that, but apologies to our friends on the webcast who've had to wait 5 minutes for this to start. This is an important occasion on many levels, not least, in fact, absolutely most, because of the report and the substance we're going to be talking about today. But I think it's good to recognize just a couple other things institutionally. First, that the issue of inequality is something that now has received unbelievable attention in the last year or so, including at the highest levels, but it was sort of in the category of weather. Everybody complains about it. Why doesn't anybody do anything about it? And I want to commend the fund for, in the latest in a series of ways in which it is trying to be objective and constructive and not just sit on its crisis management, but get ahead of issues for doing this report. And I know a huge team in the Fiscal Department and other groups worked on this, and I really want to commend them for it. The second thing is I have to do a bit of self-promotion. We have been doing our own work on inequality. Thomas Hellebrandt, Jacob Kierkegaard, Danny Blanchflower, and myself here at the Institute, and it will be coming out in coming months. It's a nice complement to, I think, the work that we're going to talk about today, because our work, supported by the Aranda Foundation, is about the non-fiscal aspects of inequality, business practices, labor practices, other things, whereas this, of course, is very much focused on, today's event and report, are very much focused on if a political decision is made to deal with inequality, then how is the best way to deal with it in a fiscal form. Third reason I just want to quickly say is thank you to the IMF's Public Affairs Department and the people working for David and others there. We have been very fortunate to host some terrific releases by the fund, including a few months ago the energy subsidies release, which David also presented here at the Peterson Institute. And we are delighted that the fund wants to do this because they bring substantive work and they're here for substantive exchange. Not just putting it out there and publicizing it, and that's what we love. In that spirit, final bit of intro, I just want to point out that we've got two superb people here of great experience and wisdom to discuss the fund's report. Nancy Birdsall is, of course, the founding president of the Center for Global Development, previously executive vice president of the American Development Bank, one of the leaders on development thinking throughout the U.S. and arguably the world. And, of course, the CGD we think of as our sibling institute, not to gender it, that grew up here under Fred with Nancy and is now exceeding us in size, and I hope merely competing with us for influence. But it's terrific to have Nancy here. And then we also have discussing, just again, in a sense it's Old Friends Week, but why not have the best? Robert Lawrence of the Kennedy School, who is also a long-term non-resident senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute, who's been doing work through the years on the effects of globalization, on labor markets, on inequality, and he will be coming at this with a very different perspective that we hope will broaden the discussion. David is going to speak shortly, and will not at short, he wants to give you the real substance. And then we will have comments from Nancy and Robert, and then we will open up for on-the-record discussion. Just briefly, I once said something about a person not needing an introduction, and the person stood up and proceeded to make fun of me, so I'm not going to do that. David Lipton, as all of you know, is the first deputy managing director of the IMF. He's been in that post since September 1, 2011. He previously had served at the White House as special assistant to the president. He's been a managing director at Citigroup. He's been at Moore Capital, and of course in the Clinton administration, he was the less recognized, equally important member of the committee that saved the world at the U.S. Treasury. And prior to that, did amazing work on transition in Eastern Europe, where, of course, Anders Aslund and Simeon Jankov and many of our colleagues continue to interact with him because that transition is not yet complete. I view David as quite inspirational, as simply one of the best international public servants we have. And I'm delighted to welcome him back to the Institute. Thank you, David.
I think you should have said, save the world, if briefly. Adam, thanks so much, and thanks to the Peterson Institute for hosting it. These events are great for us. It's a great opportunity for those of us at the IMF to take work that we've done, serious work, and bring it before your whole community and explain what we've been working on, get reactions, and start to get some of our views around. And that's what I want to do today. I also want to thank all of you for coming out. I hope we'll have a good discussion. But before I start, I also want to say thanks to the Peterson Institute for all the work that you do in supporting us at the IMF. I want to mention that a piece was just published by Ted Truman on the question of our quota and governance reform. It's, I think, one of the most excellent pieces on this subject that I've seen, or perhaps that's ever been done. I recommend it to all of you. I hope it is read all over Washington. Today I'm going to present the findings from our study on fiscal policy and income inequality. That study will be published later today. We have here Sanjeev Gupta, the head of our acting head of our Fiscal Affairs Department, and many of the people who have worked on this study, so thanks to all of you for this great work. Income inequality has been rising in many parts of the world in recent decades, and this and the social tensions associated with fiscal consolidation that many have faced, in part stemming from the global financial crisis, have put the distributional aspect of government's tax and spending policies at the heart of the public debate in many countries. Of course, the question of just how much redistribution the state should do is at core a political question, and one that economic analysis really can't address. But I think we can all agree that whatever degree of redistribution governments choose, it should be done with fiscal instruments that achieve those distributional objectives at the minimal cost to economic efficiency. So the design of growth-friendly, efficient redistributive fiscal policies is the focus of today's presentation. Now, some of you may be surprised that the fund is engaging in a debate on the design of redistributive policies. But the truth of the matter is that we've been at this a very long time. Assessing the effect of tax and expenditure policies on efficiency and any potential trade-offs with distributional goals has long been an important component of the IMF's policy advice. Furthermore, in our program discussions, when we discuss social safety nets or health and education expenditures, how to generate the revenues to finance and sustain those programs, those are subjects we routinely treat. We're discussing redistributional policies, and we've been doing that for decades. Our record for protecting the poor in the design of fund-supported programs has a long-standing history, one that goes back to the Kamdassu era in the 80s and 90s. So this paper should be seen as the fund's advice to its membership based on our extensive experience. Of course, the reason that we're bringing it up today is because it's becoming a hot subject. Interest in redistribution reflected in public opinion polls, whether here in the United States or around the world, and our many interactions with our members shows that interest in the subject is higher than in the past. Our members want to explore with us how they can pursue redistributive policies, but do it in the most efficient manner. So the key message that I want to convey today is that when it comes to fiscal redistribution, design matters. This is consistent with the recent study put out by Jonathan Ostry, who's here, and his colleagues from our research department, which finds that inequality is in fact associated with lower growth. So that implies that, and their work, I think, implies that fiscal redistribution can, in fact, help to support growth because it reduces inequality. What we see is a diversity of experience around the world, across countries, with the redistributive policies that they've pursued. Some redistributive fiscal policies can help improve efficiency and support growth, such as those that enhance human capital of low-income households. But I also want to be clear, redistributive policies can generate a trade-off between equality and efficiency, and if misconceived, the trade-off can be very costly, very negative. We're not advocating any old redistribution. We're trying to look at how to make redistribution as positive as possible. I'll cite some examples of undesirable efforts at redistribution later on. But as I said, design matters, and smart design can help to minimize the adverse effects of redistributive policies on incentives to work, to save, to invest. So my discussion today will cover three topics, including trends in inequality, the experience of countries using redistributive policy, and options for achieving more efficient redistribution. So let's move to this slide. I don't know if that should be legible to most of you. This is a discussion of, I want to start the discussion with trends in inequality. This figure presents the trends in the average Gini coefficient for disposable income. Gini coefficients, of course, range from 0 to 1. Larger values represent higher inequality. Disposable income is market income after income and wealth taxes and cash transfers. So looking at that measure, over the last 3 decades, the Gini coefficient has increased in most countries, indicating a rise in inequality. In Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a declining level of inequality more recently. What's most striking in the figure, however, is the persistent differences across regions, with Latin America having the highest inequality and the advanced economies having the lowest. More recently, there's been great attention to the rising share of the top income earners, which is another way to look at inequality as distinct from the Gini coefficient, which looks at the entire distribution of income and wealth. The trends across countries appear mixed. In some economies, such as the United States and South Africa, the share of the top 1% has increased dramatically in recent decades, but not so much in continental Europe and Japan, where it's largely unchanged. There are differing views of the causes of this rising share in the top 1%. Some emphasize the impact of globalization and new technologies, while others highlight policy choices such as the reductions in tax rates or the rent-seeking behavior of companies. If we compare the distribution of income with that of wealth, we can see that wealth is much more unequally distributed, as indicated by the higher Gini coefficients. In a similar vein, a recent Oxfam study found that the richest 85 people in the world own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. Both the high degree of inequality of wealth and the increased share of the top 1% have fueled a lot of the interest in the subject we're talking about today. Let's now turn to country experience with different instruments for fiscal redistribution. And we'll start with the advanced economies, where, as you can see in this chart, countries have already been doing a very substantial amount of redistribution. Recall that the average Gini coefficient in the absence of any redistribution is 43 for this group of countries. Redistributive transfers and taxes reduce inequality by a third. The black line means 14 or so points of reduction in the Gini coefficient. And you can see that about 2/3 of that comes from the blue bars from transfers, with the remaining third coming from taxes. That previous slide doesn't include the impact of in-kind benefits, such as public spending on health, education, and housing. In the countries selected here, it's estimated that in-kind transfers further reduce the Gini by, on average, more than 10 percentage points. Thus, we can conclude that based on both direct and in-kind benefits, fiscal policy has played a major role in reducing inequality in advanced economies, although its extent varies from country case to case. Well, what about developing countries? Developing economies here include both emerging and low-income countries. It appears that fiscal policy has played a much more modest role than in advanced economies. So let's first take a look at the tax side. The levels of tax revenues are significantly lower in developing countries, with the exception of emerging Europe. In terms of composition, indirect taxes, like the value-added tax, account for a much larger share, which tends to be less progressive than direct taxes such as the income tax. On the expenditure side, again, levels of redistributive expenditures are much lower, particularly when it comes to social protection. A lot of the social spending in developing countries is not well designed and targeted and actually increases inequality. With the exception of emerging Europe, we find that the poorest 40% of the population receive less than 20% of the benefits of social protection spending. The coverage of social benefits, in terms of the percentage of poor households that receive benefits, is also low, except in emerging Europe and in Latin America. So in this context, it's important to note that many developing countries use energy subsidies as a form of social assistance. This is the topic that I was here to discuss a year ago. As we underscored in that work, energy subsidies tend to disproportionately benefit upper income groups. Education and health spending in developing economies is also not well targeted, and it also exacerbates inequality. In many developing countries, for example, the poorest 40% receive less than 40% of the total benefits, hence in contributing to inequality of opportunity and low intergenerational mobility. One reason for this is that the poor often lack access to these services, reflecting the fact that many of them live in remote, poor, rural areas, and services are concentrated more in urban areas. This discussion of the redistributive effect of fiscal policy in advanced and developing economies has important implications for the design of fiscal consolidation packages. We show in our paper that a number of countries have adopted progressive adjustment measures as part of their recent fiscal consolidations. As a result, the burden of their adjustment on the bottom 20% of the population was lower than that of upper income groups. For example, in some of our European programs, Greece, Latvia, Portugal, Romania, and Spain, cuts in public sector pay were smaller at the lower end of the civil service spectrum. In Spain and the United Kingdom, increases in income taxation were borne more heavily by upper income groups. So the design of fiscal consolidation can be made redistributive in nature. Let me turn then to options for designing fiscal redistribution in an efficient manner. We see four key considerations in designing efficient redistributive fiscal policy. First, redistributive fiscal policy should be consistent with macroeconomic policy objectives. I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear someone from the IMF say that sentence. The level of spending on redistribution has to be consistent with maintaining macroeconomic stability. The benefits of additional spending on redistribution should be compared with the benefits of raising spending in other priority areas, such as infrastructure. Second, taxes and expenditures should be evaluated jointly. This is actually not often done. For example, an increase in value-added taxes used to finance higher spending in secondary education could on net be progressive. And since in politics many things are done as packages, we think it's important to think this way. Third, the design of redistribution policies should account for both redistributive and efficiency objectives. Some redistributive policies may, in fact, enhance efficiency, such as those that strengthen human capital. But with others, there may be the need to manage a trade-off. And fourth, design has to take into account administrative capacity. This is very clear in the execution of health, education, or social safety net programs. Based on these principles, we examine a range of options for achieving redistribution efficiently. The paper provides an extensive discussion of instruments and how to use them. In the interest of time, I'll focus on a few of the most important options that we discuss in the paper. These measures could be implemented as part of long-term fiscal reforms aimed at achieving redistributive objectives more efficiently. They could also be integrated into the design of fiscal consolidation strategies that aim to help governments achieve redistribution goals at a lower fiscal cost. The primary contribution of taxation to reducing income inequality is through the financing of redistributive spending measures in a way that doesn't harm growth. Nevertheless, taxes can also have a direct effect on redistribution, and that's particularly the case with income taxes. To start, countries should consider making their income tax systems more progressive. For example, in economies where a flat rate is used, there may be scope for more tax progression at the top. Since the mid-1990s, 27 countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, have introduced flat tax systems, usually with a quite low marginal rate. And while we understand the reasons why that was done at particular moments, it's clear that redistributive goals should be considered as time goes on. The top personal income tax rate, of course, needs to be set with care. We have plenty of experiences in advanced economies of very high marginal tax rates leading to problems. If marginal tax rates are too high, taxpayers will find ways to avoid or to evade taxation. The higher rate may actually no longer even raise revenues. In many developing countries, both fairness and equity could be enhanced by bringing more informal operators into the personal income tax system. There's also scope to more fully utilize property taxes, both as a source of revenue, but also as an efficient redistributive instrument. This applies also to developing economies where only Colombia, Namibia, Russia, South Africa, and Uruguay collect more than 1% of GDP through recurrent property taxes. So there's room for the use of this instrument more broadly. Indirect taxes, including the VAT, are generally less effective in achieving redistributive goals than direct taxes. On the VAT, our recommendation is usually to minimize exemptions and special rates in order to efficiently raise revenues to help finance pro-poor spending. For example, elimination of reduced value-added tax rates in the UK and using the proceeds to increase social benefits would significantly affect inequality. Earlier work at the IMF showed that in Ethiopia, the net impact of a uniform VAT rather than one with preferences, with the proceeds used for general spending on education and health, would have a very strong progressive impact. However, where capacity constraints prevent spending programs from reaching the poor, there can be a case for some differentiation among VAT rates. For example, basic foods that are a large part of the spending basket of the poor. On the expenditure side, I'd like to start first with education. Improving the access of low-income families to education is an efficient tool for boosting equality of opportunity and, over the long term, reducing income inequality. In advanced economies, this entails increasing the access to tertiary education for low-income families, including through scholarships and loans. For developing economies, a strengthening of access to quality secondary education is more likely the focus, eliminating tuition fees, a likely instrument. Along the same lines, improving the access of the poor to healthcare services in developing economies can provide a head start to greater opportunity and do so in an efficient manner. So some countries, including China, Ghana, India, Mexico, have taken important steps towards universal coverage in recent years. In advanced economies, maintaining the access of the poor to health services during periods of expenditure constraint is also consistent with efficient distribution. To make social transfers more efficient in advanced economies, there could be a greater use of active labor market programs and in-work benefits for social benefit recipients. This would, for example, require beneficiaries to participate in active labor market programs, such as job training, as a condition for receiving benefits, as is done in Belgium, the Slovak Republic, and Slovenia. The second reform that I'd like to mention is to expand conditional cash transfer programs. These programs make benefits conditional on the attendance of children at health clinics and at schools, an appropriate approach in developing countries. Means testing can be used to help maintain a low or modest fiscal cost. Such policies can help boost both the equality of opportunity and income inequality directly. For instance, the direct impact of such transfers in Brazil and Mexico accounts for 1/5 of the reduction in inequality over the last 2 decades in these two countries. A strengthening of administrative capacity is required in order to be able to implement programs like this more broadly across developing countries. Pensions have played an important role in reducing income inequality. To improve the sustainability of pension systems and maintain their role in protecting the elderly poor, many economies could consider increasing effective retirement ages. This would need to be accompanied by measures to ensure that low-income workers are fully protected as needed, with disability pensions and social assistance if they turn out to be unable to work. In developing economies, to ensure wider coverage of pensions at a reasonable fiscal cost, a viable option is to expand non-contributory, means-tested social pensions. Social pensions in some form exist in both emerging and low-income developing countries, including Chile, Ethiopia, India, and South Africa. Many countries have been grappling with the twin challenge of putting their pension systems on sound financial footing while safeguarding or expanding their important role in alleviating old-age poverty. So I'd like to take this opportunity to bring to your attention a new book by the IMF, Equitable and Sustainable Pensions, Challenges and Experiences. Though you see a picture of it there. It's available outside. We're launching this book today. The book examines the complex equity issues involved in designing pension systems, including generational and gender equality issues. It also presents 12 country case studies to help draw lessons for designing sustainable and equitable pension systems. Let me end where I started. Many advanced and developing economies are facing the challenge of rising inequality. Fiscal policy has played a major role in reducing inequality in the past, and it remains the primary tool available for governments to affect income distribution. Whether these policies help or hurt growth is all a matter of design, and the details matter. Thus, debates on the impact of government's redistributive policies must go far beyond a mere discussion of tax and spending ratios. In the end, it's the design that will matter. And on this, the good news is that quite a lot is now known about how governments can best address the challenges of squaring their equity and their efficiency concerns. That's a task on which the IMF stands ready to help. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. As always, substantive, to the point, and putting out a lot of controversial food for thought in a very calm manner. I'd like to ask Nancy Birdsall to come up and give her reflections, obviously, particularly for the emerging market development side of the story.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's always a pleasure to be at the Peterson Institute, and I'd just like to mention that Adam Yes, we're siblings, but I still think of you guys as the big brothers and us as the little sisters. It's an honor to have this opportunity to talk about this new report from the IMF, which is one in a series from the Fiscal Affairs Department that's really very impressive. David mentioned the most recent one that's coming out today, and there have been earlier ones, not only the energy one, but one bringing out the problem of underpricing in general of so many of the public bads that are out there in terms of particularly global public goods. And of course, the headliner today is that the IMF is highlighting the cost of inequality to growth. That's the headliner. What I want to do is have one kind of nuanced complaint to make it interesting, and then I want to make 2 points to emphasize wearing my hat as a development economist. This is emphasizing points that David Lipton made, but trying to bring them out in a slightly different way. So what's the complaint? The report does so well in summarizing what has now been 10, almost 20 years of increasingly good research on the costs of inequality and showing that fundamentally in most settings, in many settings, it's bad for growth. But it is very cautious. It takes a cautious stance, as you heard from David, on redistribution as a solution in some part to inequality. I thought it would be fun to remind you of Arthur Oken's leaky bucket. This leaky bucket, this is about the problem that you can fill up the bucket with taxes from the rich, but when you start to carry the bucket down to help the poor, it's leaking a lot. And Oken brought out the incentive problem, that when you tax the rich, they're less likely to work, and when you bring benefits to the poor, they're less likely to work. So this is a traditional and important point about the trade-off between equity and efficiency, which David referred to several times, which is in a sense also a trade-off between growth and equity. And that's the way the world has approached this issue, or let's say mainstream economics has approached this issue for a long time. And who could argue that trade-offs don't matter? I'd just like to say, and this is sort of why I'd call it a mild complaint and a nuanced complaint, that the evidence is increasingly there that they don't matter nearly as much, the trade-offs. And David mentioned the research. Jonathan Ostry is here with Andy Berg and Sangaridis at the IMF that is suggesting it's hard to find evidence that redistribution itself is other than neutral in terms of its effect on growth, and that to the extent that redistribution reduces inequality and that inequality is bad for growth, we can conclude that the leaky bucket may not be the right starting point. Forget the leaky bucket for a few minutes would be my point of view. It doesn't mean there might not be leaks, but it means you start from a different point. That redistribution from the rich to the poor could actually work out to be okay. Now, what I want to do, wearing my hat as a development economist, is just bring out a couple of points that David made and emphasize them somewhat more. And I'm hoping that Rob will focus on some of the advanced economy issues, including the U.S., which I know is of compelling interest for many people here, including me. So theory suggests that inequality is a bigger problem in terms of growth for developing countries than for the advanced economies. Why? Because inequality doesn't have any obvious direct effect. It works through channels. And what are those channels? Let me give you two simple examples. One is the way markets work in the first place. If markets are working reasonably well, consider the credit market, inequality is not going to impose the same costs in terms of growth. So that's the classic example from, again, textbook economics. I've done sort of a very random, non-random survey of taxi drivers in Washington over the years, most of whom are immigrants. Most taxi drivers who are immigrants, within a year of arrival in the U.S., are able to borrow and buy their taxi cab, at least from my non-random sample. In contrast, if you look at recent research on Africa based on World Bank enterprise surveys, my colleague Vij Ramachandran has done some work on this, you have a situation in Africa with small firms and very large firms, and very few in between. And it turns out that black Africans don't get to be heads, even if they're successful in a small enterprise. They don't ever climb the ladder to a medium enterprise and a large enterprise. One of the problems is very poor access to credit. So that generates more inequality than otherwise because the credit market isn't working well. Second channel is government, because in advanced economies, as David illustrated, governments compensate for initial unequal endowments through investments in human capital and other steps. Governments in developing countries are less effective at doing that. It's just a simple example. Third channel is politics. As difficult as the politics are in advanced democracies, in terms of generating the will and the tax and the revenue to do any redistribution, they're tougher in developing economies. Democracies, even when they are democracies, just don't operate as well. There is no such thing in reality as the median voter theorem. All over the world, but more so in the developing world, it's the middle class and the upper middle class and the rich that matter most. So that's background on developing countries. So 2 points that David made that I'd like to emphasize as a development economist. The first is that, well, maybe he didn't put it this way, but there's more room for redistribution in the developing countries on the revenue side than on the expenditure side. Conventional wisdom has long been that when you do redistribution, you mostly want to do it on the expenditure side. And that goes back to the leaky bucket, which I should hide because I don't want you to keep thinking about just the leaky bucket, the non-leaky bucket. And the report actually is kind of refreshing in the extent to which there is emphasis on redistribution through the revenue side. And you saw that in the presentation that David made. But I think we could emphasize even more for developing countries that that's the point. It came out in some of the charts that David showed you. There are really some limits to how much more money you can push through the leaky pipes into health and education, basic health and education. In fact, the developing countries have done very well in the last 2 decades in increasing the proportion of revenue spent on those basic services that do generate progressivity overall. They haven't done very well, as David said, in other areas. And conditional cash transfers, there are limits to how far you can go with conditional cash transfers. In fact, I'd be a doubter of how well they can work in lower income countries than Brazil and Mexico for various reasons. So the problem is in developing countries that if you spend more money on schooling, it's not obvious that children will learn more. They're not learning very much at all. There's a crisis in learning. We have a wonderful new book of Lant Pritchett from the Center for Global Development that shows a huge problem of children staying in school year after year and learning really nothing. Average scores on internationally comparable tests are 2 standard deviations lower than the OECD median for most developing countries. So there's just so much money you can push now in addition through those pipes. In addition, some of the subsidies that seem as though they would be redistributive increase the incentives for informality. And this is something that Santiago Levy at the Inter-American Development Bank has been pushing on. He's very concerned about that approach. So for many developing countries, it's a matter of more revenue, frankly, for public and collective goods, for infrastructure, goods that benefit everyone proportionately, which is going to mean a lot for the relatively poor. That's the first point. Revenue side, more creative thinking on that side. Second point, as David did emphasize or mention, far more emphasis on the revenue side to get beyond the VAT. The IMF has done a magnificent job in the last 20 or 30 years of introducing and helping countries administer the value-added tax. And bravo. But now it is time to really think through how to deal with the administrative problems and other problems with non-direct taxes. We know from Latin America that a group of people who are no longer poor but are far from middle class, they're very much at risk of falling into poverty, are paying far more in indirect taxes than they're getting, for example, in non-contributory pensions. The case in Brazil. Brazil has the non-contributory pensions that David supported. On the other hand, the rich and developing countries are really not paying taxes. I won't go into too much evidence about that. Let me summarize. I would advocate a slightly different starting point than the leaky bucket. That we know now that redistribution actually can support growth. And I would say especially in developing countries. And 2 points for developing countries: more thinking on how to do it on the revenue side, and on the revenue side, get beyond the value-added tax. Thank you very much.
The kind of engagement we want: criticism, specific replies. Looking for more, I turn to Robert Lawrence.
Thank you very much. It's also really a pleasure for me to be here, to be on the panel with Nancy, and to comment on this, what I regard as a very good study. David gave us an overview presentation, but what impressed me was the care which had been taken in being clear about what the study was and was not doing, and an awareness of the subtleties involved in throughout the report. The recommendations, for instance, a recommendation where they advocate the use of things like an earned income tax credit, an awareness of the labor market impact of that as you withdraw it, a recommendation that you ought to extend the retirement age, an awareness that that has serious implications for the health of certain workers. So I found it impressively nuanced in the way it analyzed the questions. I also appreciated the fact that they emphasize, I'm just oversimplifying, that all inequality is not created equal, that there are a variety of sources of inequality, and that indeed some of these, I think it's too easy to either say inequality is going to generate growth or not. I think inequality is an intrinsically endogenous variable, and much depends on what's causing that inequality. So it's the starting point for a conversation, and not really a useful generalization, but that's my own view. Now, in my comments, I thought I'd do three things. I firstly want to contrast, and this is all based on the evidence in this study, contrast between what people appear to say they want and what the governments are actually doing. The second thing I want to contrast is what the fund advocates in this paper and what the fund presents us actually works. And then thirdly, I want to make some general comments on some specific issues. The paper brings out very clearly that the polls tell us the public is increasingly concerned about inequality. And I think if you looked at American polls, you'll see over the last couple of years the concerns have become even more salient. So clearly there's a rising concern about this issue. But what is nicely brought out in the paper is what governments have been doing. One of the noteworthy results of the paper is that the efficacy of redistributive policies has actually diminished over the last 2 decades. That if you took the Gini coefficient that is determined by the market and then asked, well, how much redistribution occurs, and you then look at disposable income, what they show is despite the fact that inequality has been rising, the amount of redistribution the governments are actually undertaking have been falling. And not only do they give us this aggregate result, which is very interesting, we also hear along the way that in many countries the top marginal rates have been lowered. In many countries, corporate taxes have been cut. In many countries, wealth is taxed more lightly. Inheritance taxes are much more lightly taxed. So while the public is very concerned on the one hand, what the governments are doing actually doesn't quite conform to what the public appears to want. And this allows me to pick up something which Nancy referred to, which is the notion that somehow what we're going to get in policy is what the median voter wants. We're not seeing, it seems to me, outcomes which are necessarily those which the median voter wants. I think what we're seeing is far more politically driven. And in fact, I would hypothesize that if you thought politically, what you're seeing is something much closer to $1 one vote than one person one vote. So that's what's actually happening on the ground. The second issue relates to the policy prescriptions. Now, it's near and dear to my economist's heart when we are told to target, and target as precisely as possible. I teach it in all the classes. So that in that logic leads you to say that efficient fiscal policy targets those who really need the help most and gradually withdraws it as they get wealthier. That's efficient targeting. And it's a theme which is repeated throughout their recommendations. If you actually look at the empirical evidence of, as we were shown, about which countries are most effective in redistributing and how do they do it, it turns out that the countries that are most effective are doing it through mechanisms that are not means tested, that they are doing it through general expenditures. So that got me to thinking. The fund, as is quite appropriate, concerns itself about fiscal sustainability. But if we're thinking about policies in the real world, we also need to ask ourselves, what about political sustainability? And I would submit again that political sustainability actually is much greater when the middle class is both being taxed and getting large benefits. And of course, we see this in the debate in the United States about Social Security or about Medicare, where those are programs which are generic in character and which appear to operate effectively to deal with poverty. So, I simply draw this contrast. And what I take away from this is that behind the scenes, there's a lot of political forces at work. And the problem with the targeted policies is that you isolate, not only are you accurately isolating poor people to give them the benefits at the lowest cost, but you're also isolating the programs where they're most likely to get the least political support. So my takeaway is very political in character. But what it suggests is we need to think more carefully if we're going to prescribe. This is the starting point. This ultimately is our goal. Do it efficiently. But political sustainability also is very important. And so I was struck by the evidence that it seems to me we're in danger in societies that the wealthy are able to tinker with the system or to manipulate it in a way that makes it less redistributive, and the poor are less able to defend the targeted programs. So those were the two comments I wanted to make and draw out the political implications. The third relates to some specifics in recommendation. For my taste, the treatment of capital and capital taxation was very limited in the paper, far too limited. You'll notice the emphasis on progressive income tax, but virtually no mention of corporate taxes. And evidence is introduced, and it is certainly a valid point, that in a global economy where capital is mobile, it is very difficult to tax capital. In fact, the incidence of a tax on a mobile factor will be small. They do note, however, that rents earned by capital can be taxed, and effectively, to the degree that you do have rents, you have an opportunity for taxation. That takes me firstly to the need for more attention to the causes of inequality in thinking about the policies when we redistribute. If, in fact, inequality is rising, particularly for the top 1%, through mechanisms like winner-take-all, the implication is that the very wealthy are earning high rents. And so you might be taken in the direction of thinking more about whether or not those returns ought to be taxed. And similarly, I would suggest that as an international monetary fund, clearly there's a global dimension to capital. And the reason it's problematic for nation states to redistribute is precisely that capital is mobile. But at the level of the world, capital is completely immobile. And so it pointed out to me a final kind of suggestion that I would have, or addition, which is to look much more at the possibility of coordinating tax policies globally. There's mention of OECD efforts and so on, but I think far more attention ought to be paid. And then just to capital taxation. And really finally, the paradigm behind the analysis in this paper is that taxes are raised in a pot and then redistributed. And in that context, for instance, it makes complete sense to advocate more use of property taxes. But when you recognize that in many countries, there's segmentation in programs, and so that in the United States, for instance, property taxes are used frequently to fund school districts and school programs, and under those circumstances can actually be a mechanism for perpetuating inequality. So I did think as well that contextualizing the policies is also an important part of the story. But let me just end by saying that this is an excellent piece of work, and I think it provokes exactly the right kind of discussion, and it is taking us in an important and useful direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to ask our three speakers to come up, attach your microphone to their lapel, and get ready for discussion. Unless David would like to rebut something that Nancy or Robert said, I would open it up to questions from the floor. As usual, there is a standing mic in back. There's a moving microphone up front, which unfortunately is not moving while this microphone is being installed, but that's okay. Fine. We have Joe. Please identify yourself, and even if making a statement, pretend it's a question. That's not directed at you.
Hi, this is Jo Marie Griesgrauber with New Rules for Global Finance. And first, I want to congratulate the IMF researchers and also the commentators. Robert, I want you on my board. I wanted to note that the entire paper posits individual countries as though they're islands. And I think we really do need to see the interconnectedness. And I guess my comments are recommendations for future work or application. And there's a lot of work going on now, not only through BEPS, but also through the IMF, looking at cross-border tax policies and their consequences for the poor. And I think that needs to be integrated into this paper because there's more than a leaky bucket in terms of loss of tax revenue, especially to the poorest countries. And another point...
Not a point, a question, please.
The question is, okay, how are you reconciling increasing the age of retirement when the Earth has a surplus of young unemployed people?
Thank you. David, do you or anyone else want to comment on any of that?
Comment on a couple of pieces of this.
Oh, dear.
On your question, I think it's appropriate in some places and not in others. It really matters what the demographics look like. It is an issue when the dependency ratio is rising and when there are fewer workers to support the retired or retiring community. And it may not be as pertinent an issue in a country like Mexico with a huge number of young people in its demographic. So I think the question of what, and I think the paper goes into this, the question of what is the right treatment of pensions depends on objectives about the pension system itself, that the objectives of the pension system are fulfilled, but also the fiscal circumstances in which the country finds itself, that it all has to work out and add up and be consistent with overall macro.
Thank you. Unless Nancy or Robert wants to come in, this gentleman here.
I was director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the firm for 20 years when some of these issues started coming up, where there were several conferences, we published books, etc., etc. I want to make 2 or 3 comments. The question of
I'd actually ask you to phrase them, Vito, as questions rather than comments.
No. They are questions, but coming to comment. The first one is that income distribution is very much like health. You can deal with health problems in countries either by doing something after people get sick, or to prevent them from getting sick. And much of the discussion in today's had to do with the fact that we have a worsening income distribution and what kind of taxes and spending we introduce to correct that. But what about chronic capitalism? We read a lot about it. They were in the comments. They were referenced to the political process. We know that influence and become lobbyists. What are they doing as lobbyists? They are influencing the capitalistic process. Really, the income distribution issue should be faced not only in an export sense, after the scene has been committed, but in trying to think about the arrangement that we're introducing in society. Globalization has been mentioned. Clearly, globalization came with certain policies which liberalized capital movement, but at the same time we didn't do anything but coordinating this process so that we could continue taxing people. This was the first big question. The second one, which was really, to me, is a strange omission, is that we talk a lot about the fiscal policy, and I'm glad I'm a fiscal economist. I spent my life, last half century on this. But what about monetary policy? Ask yourself, zero interest rate policy, who is getting the loans from the Federal Reserve System? And what are they doing with that money? I get letters from Citibank or American Express which tell me that if I want to...
No, don't hold your finger up at me. You've done enough, Vito.
I'm finishing. If I want to borrow, I can pay 15% rate. When everybody else tells me that interest rate is zero, who's benefiting from that?
Thank you. Just to note, I'm not trying to be mean to any particular person, but we want to allow as many people as possible to comment, and that's why we're constraining people. In terms of the monetary policy issue, it's not the topic of today, but I would commend to you the studies done at the Bank of England, some of which while I was there, looking at the distributional impacts of quantitative easing policy, and we actually find they're quite small. But turning to the more important topics of today, Nancy, do you want to say something?
Most recently in Venezuela, it's a different issue, but in Brazil, in Turkey, etc. And a lot of the discussion has been about corruption that they're objecting. I think that at the heart of it, however, is this vague sense that somehow those who already have assets are reaping all the rents. And so it's just a comment on there are connections between rising inequality, what's the underlying causes, and the politics that Rob mentioned. And we see that phenomenon, I think a lot more of it has to do subconsciously perhaps with the fact that people know, especially in developing countries, that the rich are not paying their taxes. I mean, in Pakistan, there are only 500 households that pay the personal income tax. And it's true that globalization is undermining the ability to tax capital. All these other things are going on that are also problematic. But there's underlying that a sense of unfairness out there, which is part of the reason there are many win-win possibilities for redistribution.
Cool. Robert, David?
Well, the paper makes an important examination of the distinction between what happens when you have market incomes and then what happens with disposable income. But of course, the market income itself is determined by a whole set of policies. And some of those policies also influence income. And actually, the paper is very careful to mention these other policies. And it notes that we need to balance redistribution that might take place through explicit means, say an earned income tax credit, or through a regulatory means, say a minimum wage. Ultimately, those two will affect the market outcomes. Now, I referred earlier to the evidence of what's happened in fiscal policy in terms of the way it has become weaker as a redistributive mechanism. But I also believe that regulatory policy and other forms of government action which can affect the income distribution, the market income distribution, have also exacerbated inequality. So that it is important to have a comprehensive view. What we've got in this study is a focus on one dimension, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that ultimately the market outcome is going to be heavily influenced by the other types of policies which are implemented in regulation, in competition policy, in financial regulation, and so on.
Okay. I want to try to get a couple more questions in. Yeah.
On that.
Yeah.
All of that may be true, but the bottom line is that most of the difference between market income and the net inequality, in Latin America, in Africa, the market distribution of income is not much more unequal than in Western Europe. As David pointed out,
Okay.
most of the difference has to do with with what government is doing on the fiscal side.
Okay. David, do you want to say anything to this?
Yeah, I did want to say that there is, if you take a look at our paper, I think you'll see that there's a lot in there that's not about addressing things after the fact, but rather trying to use fiscal instruments in a way that will help sustain better distributions over time, health, education, the use of progressive or wealth and property-based taxation is meant to affect the distribution of income over time. You know, abstracting from the specifics of how the political process works, I think there's really quite a lot in this paper that's in the category that could be thought of as helping to set the stage, or if you will, prevent maldistribution of income as time goes on.
Great. I have two questions at this table, and then anybody wants to stand up at the microphone. It's fine.
From the Youth Delegation in Washington. I have a quick question to David on these along the lines of your thinking on how fiscal policy affects redistribution. Is there some thinking given to how this will have an impact on the regular surveillance of the IMF's activities, and specifically how do you see this?
Thank you.
As I started by saying, we work on this subject every day, and you know, in some sense, what we're trying to bring to everyone is the compendium of what we've learned. Now, of course, you know, as we sit and think about it, we perhaps see things more clearly, and it will give us better ways to respond. I think the injection of this subject into Article 4s is going to change, mainly because our member countries are more interested. More are asking about it. Their people are either asking about it or protesting about it. I think if you look into your crystal ball, you may foresee that this is a subject that will garner increasing interest as time goes on. So, you know, we feel we have some experience that will be useful, and we'll continue doing work to try to make sure we're ready to respond to this kind of question.
Great.
You know, in sum, I do think there will be more and more demanded by our members as a topic of discussion.
Anders?
My name is Anders Olsen, and I'm here at the Peterson Institute. I have a question for David about fund policy on lump sum taxation. In 4 countries with equal governments, this is an effective policy to bring out individual entrepreneurs by granting them lump sum taxation at a low level. It makes them legal, it activates them, it shields them from all kinds of bureaucratic troubles. When advising the Kyrgyz government, this worked. 10% of the population got into lump sum taxation, and these were the 4. And in Ukraine, 15%. The IMF has traditionally a negative policy towards this, because for good reasons you don't like loopholes, and I don't think that one should draw it back far. What's your view? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think it's right that we like to keep tax systems as simple as is practicable. But you know, many countries do face the challenge of bringing informal sectors into the formal economy. I was just in Mexico, Peru, and Chile in the last week, and in each of those countries, this is a huge question, a huge challenge. You know, in say Peru, the question is put, what incentive do people in the informal sector have to come in? If you are getting a non-contributory pension for life and you're paying no taxes, what's the incentive to come in? Now, as Nancy points out, when you're in the formal economy, in time there can be greater credit opportunities and so on. But it is a challenge to ask what's the proper fiscal regime that's consistent with a plan to try to bring greater formality. Peruvians are considering this question, and in our discussions they raised the question of could there be transitional arrangements with low tax rates, something along the lines of what you're talking about. I think it's a good subject for discussion. We'll make that subject of our next paper.
Ian Kelly, Wall Street Journal. Firstly, may I say you let the genie out of the bottle? First of all, can you give a sense, Nancy referred to this in some sense, but can you give a sense in terms of the potential efficiency gains in emerging markets versus potential efficiency gains in advanced economies? And secondly, can you acknowledge that there has been an increase or decrease in poverty based on growth? The gains that come from growth, how do they compare to the gains that come from fiscal distribution?
Again, a very good question. We just, recalling my visit to Latin America last week in Peru, this is a big subject. They have been growing, until very recently, growing very rapidly. And they also have programs to support the poor, better health and education, both in urban poor areas and in rural areas. They have cash transfer programs that they're working on. And they are finding that the poverty rate is declining very rapidly, but it is actually quite hard to figure out whether, it's the age-old question, whether it's because of the growth or because of the transfer programs. I think the weight of opinion that I heard when I was there was that it was much more because of the growth than because of the social programs and the redistribution, especially in what's happening to people who live in rural areas. They cited studies, but I haven't looked at it closely enough to know. I think the moral of the story is that whatever the division, it certainly makes sense to work on both. Peru needs to, for example, needs policies that are going to overcome the slowdown in growth that they've just experienced, to raise the potential growth rate, bring more people into the formal economy, and grow more rapidly, build infrastructure and so on, improve their health and education spending, and make sure that the reach of their cash transfer programs extend. So they really should be working and can be working on all of these margins, and there's no reason not to be doing it all.
Great. Nancy had a quick comment, and then the last question will be the lady at the back mic.
I just want to comment, it is really mostly growth, and we can understand that if you think of groups of people in these countries who are poor, and then there's a second group, I call them the strugglers, and the anxious poor, the new poor, who have gone above the poverty lines that they do not really get initial cash, they don't get cash transfers, but they're not in the secure middle class. They're the ones who benefit from non-contributory pensions. They're the ones mostly in the informal sector. They're the ones where it's tough to get them into the formal sector. And then you have the middle class. We try to put more money into basic health and education because it helps the poor. It's not working for the reason that Robert mentioned. 50% of households with $10 a day or over, which makes them middle class in Latin America, send their children to private schools. So they've already opted out. So this thing of trying to be redistributive, mostly on the expenditure side, it's really tough. That's one of the big challenges, and that's one of the reasons I emphasize the revenue side and more collective goods to get the growth engine going, and then you might get out of this vicious circle in many countries.
Great. The last question for today.
If research shows that inequality undermines sustainable growth, how do you see its rise affecting the current IMF programs in Europe? And in particular, are you satisfied with the level of protecting the poor in countries like Greece, where unemployment has exploded? And if there is reason for redistributing through fiscal policy, how do you evaluate the decision of a government that has achieved primary surplus to redistribute it as low pension and wage earners? Thank you.
Our guests may want to stick to the principles rather than the specific country, but that's up to him.
I mean, the principle is, of course, that if you lose macro stability, you're going to fail on all fronts. People in all income levels will have problems. You know, Jonathan Ostrey's study shows that on average, redistributive policies don't seem to have caused problems. There isn't a leaky bucket on average. But that doesn't mean that redistributive policies can't cause problems. And let me give you the example of Venezuela. Clearly, at the beginning, President Chavez undertook redistributive policies and provided health and education for an awful lot of poor people. I haven't seen a study of its effectiveness, but certainly people liked him. In time, those transfers have become huge. They've become a much larger fraction of GDP. The government doesn't raise taxes to pay for that. They've been printing money to pay for transfers. It's destabilizing the economy. And that is having very dire consequences. And as we see from the protests, people are unhappy. So, you know, the key point, and it's the traditional IMF point, is that really keeping macro stability is extremely important. So countries have to live within their means. And Greece has had a very difficult set of circumstances the last few years. We have tried to help them design an adjustment path to overcome their problems, along which they are able to do the best they possibly can to help ensure that poor people aren't adversely affected. But there are limits given the circumstances that they face.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Again, commendations to the staff of the Fiscal Department of the IMF that did some really creative, thorough work. Thanks to our discussants, Robert and Nancy. One last advertising plug, which jumps off the last question. Next month, in April 3rd and 4th in New York, we're doing a joint conference with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation on dealing with youth unemployment in practical terms. And we have gathered some of the world's best labor economists to come up with proposals, taking for granted if aggregate demand is stuck where it is, because you say you're Greece and you've reached the limits of what the IMF reasonably thinks you can spend, what else can you do? And that's where we're going to go next. But really, thanks to everyone, and especially thanks to David Lipton.